especially when I think of Google and Facebook, the issue about network externalities comes big. And I think is sort of something that deviates from our standard notion of markets and also our standard notion of antitrust. If I sell my main product at price zero, what it means to have a market share, okay? That's a pretty basic thing, but it's quite important. And so the question is then, however, if we have a sort of market share in terms of use, actually, I offer a glass of wine to whoever uses Bing, does not use Google. And I generally go around and make this offer and never pay any price because nobody, unless you are in China where you are prohibited from using Google, everybody in the United States use Google. Okay, so in terms of market share of searches, that represent in the United States is above 90%. You go to Facebook, you have sort of the same thing. And of course, this market power does not manifest itself in the main product they provide us because it's for free, but it does manifest on the other side, which is the advertising business, and is transforming it dramatically and concentrating dramatically. In the last year, 85% of the increase in ads online are shared by Google and Facebook. Okay, so should be worried about it, and the answer is, either you have a sort of a Panglossian view that the market always will fix the problem no matter what, and then you say, okay, let the market go. If you don't have this Panglossian view and you look at the history of this country, you think that doing something, and then we can discuss what, but doing something is probably a good idea. If you are concerned about innovation, I think the biggest spurt of innovation in this country has been associated to antitrust intervention. From the time the antitrust in the late 40s went after AT&T, who just invented the transistor, and it went actually technically for the wrong reason because it was a regulated industry, blah, blah, blah. But as a result, the transistor got widely licensed and created a new industry that would not have existed before. Then sort of the antitrust went after IBM over the 70s and contributed dramatically to the PC industry. If it wasn't for the fight during the 70s, the PC industry would not be there. Then went after AT&T and break it up, and we have the explosion of the mobile industry. Then went after Microsoft, and we have Google and Facebook. Google and Facebook today are not part of Microsoft because Microsoft was under intense scrutiny of the antitrust authority. And so they should thank that. The problem is that yesterday's startup are today's monopoly. So if you want to create a space for the new startup, I think some intervention is needed. And my view is let's try with at least the simplest thing, and this is what my article in the New York Times is about, is trying to say, at least trying to attack the sources of the digital platform and the network externality. We know that the source of the network externality that gives you market power, one of the sources is the difficulties in switching. So I'm not too worried about Uber and Lyft because the drivers can switch from Uber and Lyft in a second, and I can switch. In fact, I have both programs and look at prices and choose between Uber and Lyft all the time. So the switching cost is basically zero, and so the nature of concentration is limited. In this industry, Google and Facebook are designing to sort of maximizing this switching cost, and the structure of the government, by the way, is aiding and abetting this effort. And it says, I'm sure you're familiar with the famous case of Power Ventures versus Facebook, where Power Venture was taking from clients the password and entering Facebook in name of the person. So if I give to Jim my password to Facebook and he enters my Facebook account, he commits a felony according to the US law, the Fraud Act. Okay? So here we have the most extreme form of the power of the state, used not to protect competition, but to protect the incumbent against competition. This is the most brutal form of monopoly enforced and supported by the state. And that's what I want to fight against that particular law, against the fact that all the system is designed to make it difficult to transfer data from one place to the next. Let's take the example from the mobile industry. The reason why today we have mobile at low prices is because there was a regulation called number portability. Nobody today spends a second thinking about number portability. By the way, it's not true in every country. In the country where there's no number portability, prices are much higher, and investments and quality of service is not any better. So it's really a subsidization to bad corporate behavior by not having number portability. Number portability promotes competition. Another sector, just to say that I don't target only the tech sector, but in the banking industry, it's very complicated to transfer your bank account because you have a bunch of credit cards, wires coming in and out, and why don't we have account number portability in the banking industry? Many countries, including the European Union, are implementing in this direction, and that makes competition more effective. I want to introduce a form of social graph portability to make it easier for competition to actually work in this industry before going to other mechanisms that tend to be, by their own nature, imperfect, like antitrust.
But just to be clear, we need to take some sort of action. You mentioned perhaps an initial first step dealing with the social graph and making that portable, and others would, like to do that, and then much more up until the point of the title of this panel. They would like to break some of these companies up or take off parts of them. But the reason we need action now, what is sort of the key problem right now? Not tomorrow, what might happen because of the market power of these firms, but how that power is being used right now in a way that's detrimental to consumers is what?
Oh, first of all, we end up paying a disproportionate amount for our advertising that eventually will come back to haunt us as consumers.
So I think we're getting free stuff, but that cost is being routed through the advertising.
Absolutely, because last time I checked, Google and Facebook were not losing money, so they are making their money somewhere.
We'll fact check that one later, but I'm going to say yes. That's probably true. Right. So that's one obvious point.
Yes. Not to mention, and I set it aside because I think they are two separate issues. But should not be set aside is the issue of freedom of press. In a sense, the concentration of ads in two hands basically is compressing our freedom of expression. And the competition in the media industry is very problematic on that front, which is key not only for the function of the economy, but democracy itself.
Can you see a situation, the more extreme situations of either heavily regulating these companies as if they're public utilities, and I'm not even sure I know exactly what that means, or again breaking them up in some fashion? Because you mentioned a couple of some antitrust cases which you felt were key for innovation, the AT&T, IBM. You could probably maybe would have mentioned Microsoft, Netscape. So can you envision that kind of action being necessary at some point?
First of all, I think that it is possible. I'm not so sure that this will fix the problem, but I want to actually read a couple of sentences, and then my sort of test is if you recognize who wrote this. Big business often possesses and uses monopoly power. Big business weaken the political support for private enterprise system. Big business are not appreciably more efficient. I don't agree on this, but big business are not appreciably more efficient or enterprise than medium-sized business. Few disinterested people deny these facts. The obvious and economical solution is to break up the giant companies. This, I would emphasize, is the minimum program. It is essentially a conservative program. Who wrote that?
Ronald Wilson Reagan.
No.
Well,
Teddy Roosevelt.
Nope.
William F. Buckley?
Nope.
We're going down
James
the consent
Pethokoukis.
No, nothing short of George Stigler in a Fortune article in 1952. Now, to be fair to George, he
I knew
revised
that,
his
by the way.
position over time because he saw that big companies were more efficient, so it changed. But actually, what I like is not the efficiency part, because I think it was wrong there, and he realized over time it was wrong, but the fact that he says that sometimes breaking up companies is the conservative program because the alternatives are worse. So my approach is, I think I want to go even lighter than that, because I think that, first of all, I don't trust the government to break up in a good way. And second, I'm not so sure that breaking up will really fix the problem, because it will probably hurt these particular companies and favor another monopoly will arise the next day. So that's not my goal. If there is a gigantic efficiency gain, in the sense, unless we really attack the benefit of being all in the same place, people want to be in the social media where other people are. Okay, that's a natural.
Right, that's the natural economic.
Exactly, and so breaking that up goes against the natural economic rules, and I don't think it's going to accomplish much. The fact that Nokia or the BlackBerry went by the wayside is great in terms of creating disruption. Has nothing to say about important network industries, because in that particular case, the network did not exist. And the fact that the history is full of giants that eventually die. And that's part of the creative disruption of capitalism. That's great. Our concern is today, are the network externalities so strong that this natural creative disruption process is impeded? And I think that the good analogy, if you want, is AT&T, because AT&T as a phone industry had a strong network externality, and by the way, was investing a lot in R&D. Okay, so if that's our benchmark, was great. So I would like to ask the panel in their future answer, if they went back, will be against regulatory intervening on AT&T because we're such a great monopoly? And let's continue. The Soviet Union was investing in R&D by GDP more than the United States, and sent a man on the space before the United States. Is that a good system we want to copy just because of that? And by the way, measuring innovation on input rather than output is not that great, we know. It says Facebook spends a fortune in developing new planes. I'm not so sure that this is their comparative advantage. I don't know why they're doing it. But as a finance economist, I think it's called free cash flow, but that's a different story, okay? So I wouldn't count that as productive investment. Is more waste of free cash flow. What we care is about having more innovation. And I think that none of the panelists have addressed, in my view, the key point I made, which is today the government is directly involved in making more difficult to have competition. The Computer Abuse and Fraud Act is, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, who has just rejected to see the power venture case, is now basically blocking the ability even to give to my friend my password on Facebook. I think this is awful, and this needs to be corrected, okay? So I'm not saying we should go to antitrust yet. I at least would like to do these basic things that are not done. And until we do this, I don't see the antitrust intervening.
Right.
On the antitrust point, I think that I like very much Carl Shapiro. I read his recent piece. I think he's very good in a lot of dimensions. But there is a fundamental misunderstanding. The fundamental misunderstanding, as correctly was quoted, is the bipartisan understanding for the last 50 years has been this, okay? Which, by the way, is known as the Chicago approach to antitrust, developed by the very people that were saying those things before. And in the late 60s, early 70s, in the face of a too aggressive things of antitrust, decided to limit the power antitrust. In the late 60s, the antitrust was preventing mergers that will gain 5% of market share, okay? So that's clearly excessive, and as a result of that thing, they develop a very narrow interpretation of antitrust, which, by the way, is not written in the statute, because the Sherman Act was precisely against the power of bigness, because power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and we are afraid of those giants. So if you look at the law of the land is clear. Antitrust should not take care of all the things in the face of earth. I'm not in favor of that, but it's not just about consumer welfare, it's about sort of making sure that there is not a power that is too strong, because that will distort our democracy. And I think that is the big fear that I have, more than any economic fear, is that excessive concentration of power will lead to a distortion in our democracy. And I think that McAfee is absolutely right that there is a lot of freedom of expression. Absolutely. Some people might say even too much, because everyone say everything on Twitter. But that's only part of what the role of the free press is about. I think that in a democracy, a key role of the free press is also to hold power accountable by investigating and analyzing. And we have some great things like the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, but in the grand scheme of things, the ability to hold power accountable has been reduced over time, because the scrutiny has been reduced over time. And for sure, we need to find new forms. But we need to be conscious that this process is not without sort of friction. And probably before, the newspaper were making too much money, and the money was wasted, etc. So I'm not trying to go back to the world of yesteryear. Right. I think what we need to think about is what are the bigger consequences.
You know, it is hard for me to conceive of Facebook versus New York Times as a David versus Goliath situation. I see two big companies that are both very powerful, that are engaged in a dispute about the way that the public consumes their content and uses their network services. And I do not see this tiny little company, the New York Times, being stomped on by Facebook. I see the New York Times wishing that they had gotten out ahead of where Facebook was in terms of distributing their content before Facebook got there, and not having done so, and trying to claw back some of what they can. And I think that's an important consideration. I think, Luigi, your point about power as a general matter, I think, is important and does deserve to be reflected upon. It is not clear to me, and I could be persuaded that I'm wrong about this, but it is not clear to me that if you roll back the clock to the 1970s, when an American had 3 30-minute news broadcasts to choose from, and one local newspaper that arrived in the morning, that American was subject to less competition in the market for information and opinion.
Or was better served back then,
yes, that's
by the
right.
journalism and the information they had
That's
access
right.
to. Can I jump on that? Because I think it's a...
Can I just tell a story about Walter Cronkite?
Please don't tell Walter Cronkite.
I think
we know.
I think that's a universal absolutely.
I mean, think about, what's commonly said, right? When Johnson lost Cronkite, he lost the war. Who could say, who is there that has that kind of credibility with the American people today? It's not Chuck Todd. It's not Mark Zuckerberg.
Wait a minute. We're discussing, and I don't agree, but we're discussing if $100,000 spent in Facebook ads can swing an election. Okay? Mm-hmm. So people perceive the power of Facebook to be so enormous that you spend $100,000, you can swing an election. Imagine if you actually use it to win an election, it's going to be devastating. In 60% of the news that people receive is filtered by Facebook the way they want. Okay? So if they don't like you, if they think that your news is unimportant, it's filtered out and people don't receive it.
In a less severe way than Walter Cronkite filtered our news 2
I'm
generations
not here
ago.
to define the Cronkite.
But you're saying we're living in this dark time of access to information.
I didn't
and-
say it's a dark time. I said I'm concerned.
And the trend is in the right direction, not the wrong direction. You bring up the excellent point that a free press is vital to a democracy, right? And the best phrase I've heard about it is that the role of journalism is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. I love that phrase. There was excellent reporting, both from what we consider the mainstream media during the 2016 election. The Post and the Times did a great job. And recently, the apparent deficiencies in Facebook's ad vetting were brought up, I believe, by ProPublica and BuzzFeed. The notion that these companies are getting a pass from the press doesn't hold water.
Actually, I think the press did a terrible job because until, and I'm not a Trump supporter, but until Trump came to the picture, until he won election, how many articles did we have about the people dying of the opioid epidemics in the Midwest?
Tons.
Very few.
You
It
were
became
reading
a topic.
different things than I was.
Maybe I was reading the old news.
Case and
the
Deaton
New York
published
Times.
Deaton published a paper in 2015.
Ca-
It was extensively covered.
Case is an academic, I understand, but I'm saying what investigative journalism was done about this phenomenon.
I just
that is
answered
not
that question.
No,
It
no,
was
case
extensively covered
No,
in
no, case is not
2015.
investigative journalism. It's an academic paper that they cover. Okay, and it covered during the election when this problem was already coming up. I'm saying what level of investigative journalism was done. Think about mortgage fraud. How many articles during the financial crisis we had about mortgage fraud that was rampant throughout the United States? Very few. So I think that there is a lack, and I'm not saying that the past was perfect. Certainly Cronkite was far from perfect, but saying that now we live in a perfect world, I think that's wrong also.
Okay, if I don't get to put words in your mouth, you don't get to put words in mine.
I
think
want,
to-
I just want to say, maybe you
I
want to jump
also
on
don't
this.
think the world is perfect.
I think it could use some improvement, sure. But just to sort of
There are other examples, though, of the antitrust. You did jump on the Microsoft example, but there are also the other examples of IBM started in the late 60s and AT&T.
There was no action taken against IBM, was there?
But do you think, again, that's a similar case?
The reason why they started to license out the PC is because they were under continuous sort of threat of the antitrust enforcement. And they couldn't even mention the word market share in the board of directors for fear of the antitrust. And maybe it was excessive, but what I'm saying is there is no doubt that the reason why they was not proprietary the PC, they contract out, etc., is because of that. And I think that you're absolutely right. Other factors contributed to the demise of Microsoft was not just the antitrust, but certainly they gobble up many of their competitors before. And it says, I'm old enough to remember that there used to be a Lotus before Excel, there used to be a WordPerfect before Word, and there used to be a Eudora before Outlook, okay? All this stuff was eaten up, and they were in the process of eating up the internet browser, and probably would have not even eaten up much more if at some point an antitrust consideration was not raised. So I think that the business of business is to make money, and it's natural that they try to do these things. It's natural that you have a policeman to try to limit them. If you are saying, let's do everything, then there is the risk of abuses. And certainly what Microsoft was doing at the time was abuse. The question I'm asking the panel is, are you against today of what was done to AT&T and Microsoft back then? Well, if you were in the 50s, would you against regulating AT&T or sort of do antitrust suit at AT&T? And I want to know your answer. I'm a bit surprised is to hear that people here don't want to intervene on the marketplace, but they want to intervene massively on regulation of content and selection. It says, I don't feel as a citizen so protected by the fact that Facebook decides who gets to distribute content, who doesn't. And so what protects me is competition. how do I get competition? By favoring alternative platforms, alternative way of diffusion. Having sort of all this enormous power, the Facebook to select which stuff is reproduced, because the notion that you have, Andrew, that this spreads around is, I know that you know, but it's not exactly right, because this stuff is targeted by Facebook to maximize the time you spend on Facebook. So that they on purpose edit, so they are editor. It's not that they publish everything, because if they were to publish everything, then okay, they don't take responsibility. No, they actually choose of all the news, in a sense, the worst one, the one that clearly have more attractive content in order to induce people to look at them. So they play a negative role, they put sort of gasoline on the fire. It's not that they help the fire spread, they actually put gasoline on the fire. And I think that that's a source of concern. And to me, is much better addressed through inducing competition than to having some regulator, especially because I think you wrote a very interesting article about the level in which Facebook is embedded in the political campaign. So these guys basically own the government. And they can do whatever they want because they are bipartisan. So they own the government on both sides. And who protects us against
You don't
this
think
power?
Facebook owns the government is a touch hyperbolic?
Just to be clear, I did not write an article suggesting that Facebook owns the government.